All right. So today we're going to be looking at Russian disinformation and influence campaigns. And we know they've been part of the global threat environment for a number of years, but those campaigns really stepped up a notch after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And today's event is about understanding the methodologies of Russian information warfare, how it's happening, what impact it's having, and also what we can do to protect our information ecosystem and strengthen democratic resilience. I'm delighted today to be joined by three experts who have really been on the front lines of this. People who have been on the front lines of this information warfare and sometimes on the receiving end as well. So I'd first like to welcome the Ukrainian Ambassador to Australia, His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko. Vasyl has been Ambassador to Australia since 2022. He also himself has a strategic communications background, which has been incredibly valuable. He has co-founded the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, an NGO aimed at amplifying Ukraine's voice internationally. And it's a topic that you're deeply passionate about and have been speaking a lot about in Australia during your time here. Our other expert is Dr. Olga Boichak. Olga is Senior Lecturer in Digital Cultures at the Computational Social Science Lab here at the University of Sydney. Olga specialises in the role of information and communication technologies in shaping public perceptions and the outcomes of wars. So this is really important here because Olga looks at not just how it shapes perceptions, but how it actually affects whether a war is lost or won. And so I'm really interested to hear her insights on that topic. Before becoming an academic, Olga managed political campaigns in the Ukraine and also ran the Center for Public Opinion Research. And for all of these many achievements, Olga has been personally sanctioned by the Kremlin. Along with
Simple saying, ambassadors were not yet sanctioned, but only the best people on the list. So every time I see a list of those who get sanctions, I go there, oh, these are good people. I find them on LinkedIn, they become my friends.
That is how you turn a public narrative. Our friends are very important in this space. And finally, we have Natalia Solieva. Natalia was a former diplomat in the Ukraine Department of Information Policy. She and her team developed the social media strategies for the Ukrainian diplomatic missions abroad and the original playbooks for how to counter Russian propaganda. Natalia has since moved to the United States, where she is a media producer and is currently in the process of being appointed honorary consul of the Ukraine in Florida. Now, Natalia has been an absolute trooper. She has flown one of the longest legs that is possible to get here from Florida. And she has unfortunately lost her voice slightly as a result.
I did, but I try my best. So.
But in a complete demonstration of the Ukrainian fighting spirit, she is fighting on to be with us here today, to share her expertise, to share her insights on the front lines. Now, originally we were going to do sort of a PowerPoint presentation and move to the panel, but given Natalia's voice and given the wonderful and very large crowd that I was not expecting on this beautiful Thursday evening in Sydney, what we're going to do, we're going to just do sort of a couple of opening remarks, then a panel presentation, but then really hand the floor over to you guys for your questions and what you want to get out of today and to giving up your beautiful Thursday. So if I can invite Natalia to make some opening remarks, and then we'll have opening remarks from our other guests and we'll go from there.
Nice. So I hope that you can hear me. Very nice to see you all. This is a really great and big crowd. As it was mentioned before, we were with Ambassador on the front line of disinformation in Ukraine, starting like 2014 when the first Russian invasion happened in Ukraine with Crimea and when Russia occupied the part of Donbass. So basically my whole professional life was split in two countries. I was born in Ukraine and I was studying in Ukraine, and basically I started my career in Ukraine in 2014. And I remember that time that a couple of years before 2014 and all the information that was coming to Ukrainian ears from TV, from radio, newspapers, which later we understood there was basically Russian disinformation. And unfortunately, at that time, Ukrainian media bubble was completely engaged with Moscow. So all the entertaining shows were coming from there, all the TV channels, newspapers were completely involved with Russian content. So, and we paid later a really high price for that. So, and I remember what was the goal, right now I understand it, the goal of Russian propaganda to split Ukrainians, to give us that mentality that we are different. If you remember, maybe heard somebody who lived in Ukraine, that was like, oh, you're completely different. This is the Russian-speaking Eastern regions, and they're more pro-Russian. They're leaning politically to Russia. And Ukrainian-speaking Western regions who are more pro-European. And so you all have different political views, and those regions would never understand each other. I remember those horrible things. If people from Eastern Ukraine would visit Western Ukraine, they're gonna be, bitten and things like that, which was absolutely not true. That was something that we've been told through many generations. And I remember when actually the annexation happened of Crimea, occupation of part of Donbass, how Russia presented it on international stage for the foreigners that this is a civil war between Ukrainians. This is Ukrainians fighting Ukrainians, which was completely not true, of course. So right now, as I said, the first part of my life I was in Ukraine, and the second part of my life I moved to United States, where I live almost 10 years now. And right now, the things obviously changed politically, which is fine, right? But the polarization of American society is huge for the last at least a year. And when I hear somebody saying that that's something like information civil war, which looks like that, but I always would make a remark that it has this foreign influence on that. It's not just Americans are fighting an informational field between each other. That's definitely prompted from the malign foreign influence groups like Russia and China. So, and I see that, experience that same situation in Ukraine, and then 10 years later in the United States, which means that disinformation has no borders. When we are here in Australia or in the United States, we're thinking, oh, that's so far, the war in Ukraine. Geographically, it is. But if we're talking about disinformation, it can spread in different continents, in different countries, because disinformation very often lives in our phones, especially the nowadays disinformation that is called more like misinformation, because very often even you can share something not intentionally that is actually disinformation. Because we all have our values, we have all political views. In the time of when the nation is the most vulnerable, like elections, for example, we're always divided. But that information that we consume from social media and that is placed there by some foreign entities, very often they are polarizing us completely. And unfortunately, it can create hate among people. And it is not just a theory, because right now that's what's happening in the United States. And we should understand that United States is very good. It's like the leader in all those informational security tools and things like that. And even that did not protect them because very often the content, disinformation content, is actually aimed to reach the people who are not gonna check the facts, the sources, they are just sharing. I say that share disinformation in one click because it's enough to click share and you're already involved in spreading disinformation. So we're probably going to talk about that, what we can do with this, right? But I should say that it is actually really hard to track all the disinformation, especially in social media. Also, it depends on the country. It's mutating. So if we will find the solution for one disinformation, here is another one, right? So, and it's really hard to, deal with that completely. I think what we definitely can do, educate our society about disinformation. In the places like we're here today, like universities, for example, at the workplaces, from TV, many tools to do that. But I think it's really important to educate people to protect themselves from someday consuming that disinformation, and that may change the life of the whole country.
Thank you for that. That's a really wonderful opening to our discussions. If I can turn to you, Vasyl, you've really picked up, and if I could sort of zoom into where we are, you've noticed the impact and the methodologies of some of these disinformation campaigns in Australia, but also in our immediate region as well, which, as Natalia said, we might think that we're far away from the fighting, but in terms of that informational warfare and how quickly it spreads, we're not far away at all. It's right here at home and in our region. Can you reflect on some of what you've seen in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. You see, in the old kind of times of Cold War, Soviet propaganda was boring and it was dull. And even Soviets did not believe in that propaganda, because in our kitchens we had a different talk. It was different from what was on television. It was different from the newspapers. But we were out there discussing, well, that's all Soviet propaganda, but we had our own conversations in the kitchen. The way it all changed now, it has changed by the way media has changed, and the way Russians have adopted the best practices from America in terms of infotainment, in terms of using emotions to make your news entertaining. So people watch news not because it's a source of information, because it's entertaining. To make it entertaining, you need emotions. Fear, laughter, any kind of emotions, right? I mean, this is what it makes it very engaging. And it's the same way how social media is structured. The way the platforms of social media is structured around emotions, because only emotions help it grow, right? That's how networks expand. And this is what enables those who specifically pursue a certain narrative to spread a message. Now, this is kind of a general outline. So certainly the problem we are facing, right? And the problem we are facing kind of globally, but more so in the global South. And I would like to specifically speak a little bit about Southeast Asia. We in this part of the world, and I've been observing that. Of course, I never lived in any of the Southeast Asia. So now my home is Canberra for the past 3.5 years. But I've looked at it. I've talked to my ambassadors based in Indonesia, based in Malaysia, Singapore, and other countries. And what we see there, well, firstly, we see very little penetration of Western media. People are not watching ABC there. They're not watching CNN. They're not watching BBC. They watch their own television. They read their own news websites in their own language. So Russians have invested billions and billions of dollars in creating the infrastructure. And in Russia, just like it was in the Soviet Union, propaganda is treated very seriously. Kremlin is heavily involved, so it goes from top down, including all departments are involved. Lots of resources are allocated for that. And the government specifically works on that. Anybody who's involved in propaganda are very well-established people, high reputation, good salaries. They are media personalities on television. These are people who are running those, TV channels, radio stations, talk shows, you name it. They are all very well-established and respected people. And Russia has, after pretty much their invasion into Georgia in 2008, they realized that they need to invest more in whatever the way they project their narrative globally. And that's when they created Sputnik, and then I think Sputnik was created earlier, but this is when they expanded Sputnik. Sputnik is a news agency radio station, which is localized in every language. So in Southeast Asia, you now have Sputnik in Bahasa, you have Sputnik in Thai language, you have Sputnik in Vietnamese language. The same for RT, which is Russia today, which is also localized. And the importance of localized content, I mean, I understand many of you here could have been journalists, have an interest in that, is very important. Because generally, if you have a good story and it's already in Bahasa, you just copy paste and run it in your own newspaper. You don't need to bother translating, and it's a good story. It looks like a compelling argument. It's anti-Western because we don't like, colonizers. It's based on those sentiments which have been out there, and Russians understand what sentiment is. And generally in the global South, I mean, Soviet Union was involved in helping liberating those countries from the colonizers. Ukrainians were involved in that, by the way. But for some reason, it's only Russians who get the credit for that, because we helped, liberate, half of Africa just as much as the Russians. But for some reason, well, there is a reason for that. Soviets kept all the presence there, while we had to rebuild our presence in those countries, including in Indonesia, including in Malaysia and other places, where Russia's been always, heavily present, and they inherited the infrastructure of the Soviet Union. But they understand the sentiment, the history of those countries. They understand the non-alignment movement, which is a political historic movement of the time when different countries would not align with any countries of the Cold War. But that sentiment is still there. We have to trade and do business with everybody. And actually, the narrative from Moscow, well, need to expand it to the West. Brutally, and they provoked Russia. Russia is just fighting back. And it looks like, a legitimate reason. If you kind of look at the history of those countries who've been colonized by those European countries, they feel like, yeah, maybe, somebody's infringing upon the traditional values of Russia. And they are just a victim. They have to fight back. It kind of makes sense. So the narratives are there. We all know the narratives, right? But once you mix it up with local culture, once you mix it up with local history, it's very credible. It's very compelling. Plus, you reinforce it with emotions. And emotions comes from footage. Emotions come from video. Emotions comes from witness accounts, which Russians really know how to do. And then you go and ask people in Indonesia what this war is all about. I'm sure there are some surveys they are done. 280 million people next door, to Australia. How many of them actually support Ukraine there? And that's a big challenge, because you see, the future of democracies is very fragile, because not many left, actually. And you're one of those here, and you have New Zealand, but that's about it in your region. And democracies need to step up to fight for freedom of press, freedom of speech. And it's much more complicated, actually, than we think. And, I've been dealing with countering disinformation for quite a while. I mean, that goes back to 2014 when Russia initially invaded. I come from business, so I was in the stratcom industry. And that was a time when we realized that the government had no skill set of how to deal with new challenges. And we stepped in when we helped the government to communicate better, and we set up the structures, we trained people, we trained ministers how to use Twitter, we trained ministers how to actually use and write proper, there are teams that write proper press releases, which would be of any interest, and actually how to use video and new technology to actually engage with the public domestically, but also internationally. But the problem with propaganda or disinformation, whatever you want to call it, is that whatever story makes it and reaches to the millions and millions of people, there is no way how you can reach the same audience and tell them that it was not true. We can create multiple fact-checking resources. We can create teams who will go out there and say, oh, this is not true, this is not correct. But nobody's going to find out about it except for, academics here at Sydney who, yeah, that was fake. Like the general public, they have no clue it was fake, and they will never find out it was fake, because once they've reached the audience, you can't go back to the same audience and reach the same audience. You may disagree with me though, but this is kind of my experience. So and then you got war, right? Russians invaded another time. And with war, it becomes even more complicated, because there is lots of things which are happening in the battlefield. There are lots of military communications, psyops, they're trying to force you to give up fighting. And, propaganda traditionally through centuries was the most effective tool. How you convince your enemy of not even picking up the gun. because they convince you you're going to die anyways. And there's a lot of it happening, right? And then there is, of course, a different level. How do you explain that to the international audience? How you then try to intimidate the civilian population, and then everything works, you know? So it's both cyber attacks, it's propaganda, it's hybrid warfare. I mean, so different elements of it, and it all comes together in a bundle. And in Ukraine, we are a target for everything, right? Whereas Europe currently is now a target for lots of gray zone operations. Russians are, you know, cutting down the underwater sea cables. They are organizing explosions at some of the weapon depots. They attempted to assassinate the CEO of Rheinmetall. So there is a lot of this kind of sabotage activities, which is done by Russian intelligence spread out in Europe, which is also reinforced by propaganda. You know, reinforcing far-right movements and far-left movements. Traditionally, that was where they converge on those sides. How do you do it? Well, what's the biggest issue in Europe? What's the biggest issue in many other countries? Immigration. How can we get this issue big? Why don't we support Bashar al-Assad in killing his own people? Why don't we create and support that regime? And this is what Russians did. And then what's going to be a positive externality for Russia? You're going to see all those migrants come into Europe. Over 1 million went to only Germany. And look what happened. Alternative for Germany is now a dominant party in Germany. The same applies to many other countries where far-right movements in the past 10 years have become so strong. And a lot of that was driven by this migration from the Middle East, primarily from Syria initially. Now you have 5 million Ukrainians in Europe. So guess who's benefiting from that? Far-right movements are benefiting from that because, of course, you know, there are many different stories, and this is very easy to spin. So, you know, this is just like some highlights for you. And we can talk more about that, of course.
I really like how you picked up that the growing sophistication. You're talking about a government that was not very good at propaganda, but now it's becoming increasingly sophisticated in terms of its level of localization and in terms of its ability to engage with them. And you mentioned before about not being able to reach the same audience to dispute some of the disinformation. But I think it's also sort of a bit of a psychological challenge, because once you've engaged someone's emotion, can you actually counteract that belief with fact? If you've already engaged them with emotion, and if you've already engaged them with local issues that are particularly sensitive to that population and that galvanize that population in a particular direction. So it just makes the challenge all the harder. Now, I want to turn to you, Olga, because you've looked a lot about how sort of technology plays in Russian information warfare campaigns. Can you describe that relationship between the technology infrastructure and sort of national security in the Ukraine case?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So I'm a sociologist. I really care about what people talk about in their kitchens. And I feel like this is often overlooked, right? Because I am a media scholar, but also if we focus on technology, we risk missing out on the key events and processes that enable things, including warfare. So in early 2010s, I was working in Ukraine, setting up regional headquarters for various political parties. And at the time when we were sort of canvassing different regions of Ukraine, trying to recruit people to work at our headquarters, there were other recruitment efforts already, and we're talking 2009 and 10, by different actors, getting people, especially people who were unemployed, people who were kind of not exactly in stable positions in society, they were taking them through different boot camps. And it was just like, oh, it's innocent. You just come for a 2-week retreat and we're going to train you in something. And so in parallel with rampant disinformation rising years before the annexation of Crimea, years before Russia's full-scale invasion, there was also ground being prepared for these processes. And that is at the time when it was a very kind of low-tech environment. And that is the time when political blogs were popular. And that was, I guess, a dominant form of communicating. Then the Orange Revolution happened, and it was, again, Ukraine was portrayed as a very polarized nation, but we still kind of relied on citizen journalism a lot of the times on independent, on blogs such as the Ukrainska Pravda, Ukrainian Pravda, that was launched by Georgy Gudgadze, who was then assassinated essentially for his activities. And that was the very start. And then in 2014, of course, we had the Revolution of Dignity, and that is the first place where the role of technology became front and center. And if you remember those times, there was a lot of techno-optimism. It was following the Arab Spring, and there was a lot of optimistic discourses about the role of social media in bringing, democratizing politics and bringing people together.
Those were the days. Remember those days, guys?
And there was such determinism in seeing what the role that Facebook played in it, that is when I really got into studying it, because the people who I interviewed that were on Maidan, that were broadcasting the revolution, that were organizing using social media, were always kind of ambivalent towards the medium that they used. And every time you ask them, oh, this is so great that we have Facebook now and all of the people are on Facebook, and hey, and they would always be like, yeah, sure, that's fine, but we can also text each other, or we'll use just about any platform that is within our disposal to organize. And so that kind of parallel between what is happening in the information environment and what is actually happening on the ground, these things always work in tandem. And so technology plays a vital role, because a lot of the times it helps facilitate the gathering of those groups, the gathering of the boots on the ground. And of course, the technological landscape has changed tremendously. And so if we are talking about mid-2010s, 2015, most of at least people in Western democracies were on Facebook. And then Instagram kind of took over, and then WhatsApp. And so that was the beginning of the fragmentation of the online public sphere, where now we are in an era where you pretty much have to be a millennial to be on Facebook, where a lot of younger generations are on a lot of different platforms. We are witnessing the proliferation of Telegram, which is a huge national security concern that we tend to not talk about, because for reasons that still escape me. But in any case, it is also increasingly adopted around the world. We have Snapchat, we now have TikTok. And these are all very different media ecosystems that allow disinformation to take many forms, to migrate, to reach many different audiences in different ways. And of course, all of them are used to prepare more distinct material kinetic actions, as happened with Ukraine. And so with Ukraine, there's definitely with Russia's invasion, there were very substantive transformations that were used to essentially prepare the invasion. Even when we look at the early days of February 2022, there was a massive cyber attack on Viasat. There was rerouting of internet traffic from the occupied territories of Crimea, of Donetsk, that then also spread further towards the south of Ukraine and Kherson, with the purpose of monitoring of all communication, essentially, that goes through those online channels by Russia, with the purpose of censorship. So in a way, these are not disjointed acts. There's lots of layers to that cake. And by focusing on platforms and by focusing on disinformation, we might risk losing sight of some of those more ground level transformations that are happening in the society with regard to social groups that actually make some of the more distinctive kinetic actions possible. And so this is something that, and we're moving into a landscape that we don't really understand, because with the withdrawal of USAID programs, for example, from many countries around the world, there is now a vacuum in how a lot of media organizations function and a lot of media is produced. And in the already precarious kind of environment with regard to news that Vasyl talked about and Natalia, we further risk further fragmentation of the online ecosystem. There are already the so-called splinters in different countries around the world, and it is actually something that's very beneficial to the authoritarian governments to splinter off their citizens and create a sort of fake ghetto-ish environment for them to just hang out in, and then just reinforce each other's opinions, and then also have a hand in manipulating many different pockets of discourse in the Western democracies, So in a way, yes, I think prior to 2020, we could talk about the media landscape. And right now we're just entering a new era. And with the large language models and seeing how artificial intelligence can be used to quickly summarize things that are happening there, I have massive concerns about overall our ability to manage this ecosystem and to defend ourselves.
So that was probably going to be my next question, bringing in that element of how Russia is using the new technologies available to amplify their messages and continue to sort of splinter those groups, or splinter them into effectively echo chambers that they then, have different tactics for manipulating, right? So I saw something recently about Pravda. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Pravda, they are a Russian-backed news outlet. Should we put news outlet in quotation marks there? But they have a fairly strong overseas following and an overseas audience. It's interesting that some of the AI overviews I saw recently were generating AI overviews that quoted Pravda and presented Pravda as legitimate, unbiased, objective, journalistic links in their AI overviews. Now, you can ask that same chatbot, whether it's ChatGPT or Gemini, what is Pravda? And they will say that the chatbot will reply, Pravda is a Kremlin-backed propaganda outfit. So in one sense, the large language model knows that this source is untrustworthy, but in another sense, that same AI tool is generating news overviews using a source that they would otherwise tell you is untrustworthy. This is a really interesting problem then about it, as more people rely on AI overviews as opposed to going back to the sources. And even if they do, there's an internal disconnect between the logic of some of these systems. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, I mean, obviously it makes the challenge harder, but how do we navigate that? What's the new playbook for that?
There's no playbook. It's the Wild West. There are some things that we could do, but we know, for example, that fact checking works in about 30% of the time. It is not scalable. It's very easy to flood the fact checkers. And in fact, fact checkers have been working extremely hard over the past years. It's such a thankless, daily, very time-consuming task in verifying a lot of those claims. And with the increased proliferation of conspiratorial thinking, of conspiratorial assertions, rumors, there's so many different varieties. It's not just conspiracy theories that are these grand, well-supported narratives that kind of a lot of, fringe communities subscribe to. There's such a range of different fact-like genres that fact checkers just get flooded with, and it creates bottlenecks in our ability to process it. And a lot of us work with fact checkers, and we sometimes help them, but it's such a time-consuming task. And it turns out that for a lot of people that doesn't matter. Then we of course have media literacy education, and I must say that in Australia we do have it. We do see it in public schools. Our children are taught the things like behind the news and how news are made and different things. So it's really great to see those efforts. The problem is that if we overdo it or tweak it, or if there's ways to integrate into those media literacy trainings, it can actually be used to undermine some of the trust in different, in our social institutions. Because if we try, so of course, there will always be a contingent of people who distrust social institutions. And if those social institutions try to do media literacy training, guess what? They're also probably wrong, or probably there's some powerful conspiracy behind it why we're doing this media literacy training. So if we teach our children to question everything, and they come home and they hear that, oh, this is all, just a conspiracy, it also risks backfiring back at us, and Russia is counting on that. And of course, the third major concern is the chatbots and the automated kind of summaries and because I remember even 2 years ago, I asked ChatGPT why Russia invaded Ukraine, and I got a paragraph that made no sense whatsoever, saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a matter of debate and interpretation. So it might not have happened for all it knew. And so moving into this post-truth environment, and this is a phrase that gets thrown around too often, and maybe it's not as helpful. Maybe it's a slightly more helpful way to understand disinformation, where we have a lot of fragmented and disintegrated spheres in which many concurring and opposing claims are floating at the same time. And so what I've been looking at, what I'm actually quite optimistic about, if you will, if one can be optimistic in this current landscape, is the community-based moderation practices. And this is something that we saw happening in the ruins of Twitter, where after Elon Musk's takeover, it became completely unmoderated, right? All of the moderators have been fired. A lot of it has been replaced by different automated techniques and algorithms. And as a result, there was rampant disinformation floating on the platform. And then there were self-designated communities, most notably NAFO, the North Atlantic Fellows Alliance, which might be which some of you, if those of you who are familiar, are people familiar with NAFO, the cartoon dogs? Some people are familiar. So essentially, those are Twitter users that adopt an avatar of a dog that looks a certain way. It's a Shiba dog. It's a meme, essentially. You get for donating to support the Ukrainian army, you get an avatar with various attributes that you select yourself to represent yourself. And then you go around, you search for disinformation on Twitter, and you ridicule it. Instead of debunking it, instead of fact checking it, instead of reasoning with the trolls and explaining to them, look, you're wrong, and this is, you just turn it on their head, on its head, and you just make fun of those accounts sharing that information. And that has been surprisingly effective. So if there's anything, it's light, it's humorous, it's playful, but it's actually quite serious, and it's quite a systemic attempt. And it's showing that really, as long as there are communities that are watching that public sphere, almost like watchdogs, the watchdogs of the internet, we might have some hope.
Can I add watchdogs of the internet are Shebas, which is also not what I imagined, but this is great. I love that we're gamifying this. Yes, Natalia.
Yeah, I would agree with Olga that it also depends on the country, because something that works in Australia may not work in the United States, for example. I can explain you what's working right now in the United States. I think recently, especially after that unfortunate event was when conservative activist Charlie Kirk was killed publicly. So it actually fueled the fire and polarization of Americans completely. And we know that American society is far left or far right, and they are definitely listening their politicians, local or on the federal level. But so what they're doing right now, because I see many governors, they are like recording videos with explanation of we need to stay united. We have some disagreements. So basically they are talking to their voters, to people, to calm down the situation in the country. And it works for Americans, again, because they don't trust media, or they would not trust things like that is working in Ukraine or Australia. So I think just searching that the best way to do that, the best way to speak to people, that's actually
So if I can ask for a bit more optimism as well, Vasyl, what do you think would be strategies that could work in Australia, having been...
Oh, look, I don't have any prescriptions for Australia. It's not my job. I can lose my job for coming out with prescriptions. Yeah, I can, look, so social cohesion. And that's the problem. Is you have to understand that the purpose of propaganda is not to convince you of of that narrative or that opinion. The purpose of propaganda is to exacerbate debate, to muddy the waters, to make it unclear, to insert doubt in your kind of beliefs or whatever facts. And then you kind of lose trust. You lose trust in mainstream media, you lose trust in your government. And then once you've lost trust in that, you can believe in anything.
I would also add, you lose trust in one another as democratic citizens in a shared society.
Exactly. And in a way, you know, I think Australian society is quite resilient as a result of your legislation on elections. And I think because it's compulsory, because you have preferential voting, it kind of, I mean, this what keeps it resilient, I think, for now, because we see what's happening in Europe, we see what happened in America, and we see how a different voting system could be manipulated from the outside, right? We actually, with Natalia, worked on a case on a referendum in the Netherlands. In 2016, the Dutch government had a legislation which was then scrapped on referendums. And one party, dodgy party of one or two people in the parliament of the Netherlands decided to say, look, we have this legislation. Why don't we actually, there's this EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which is basically a free trade agreement between Europe and Ukraine, which had to be ratified in each member of the European Union. Why don't we just put it to a referendum? 2016, 3 months. So I was parachuted into the Netherlands for 3 months. We had a team of Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and we were kind of trying to convince Dutch to vote in favor of the referendum. Natalia coordinated that work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And, and Dutch government was like, oh, we have legislation, we give money to everybody. Yes vote, no vote, and neutral, right? So we gave money to everybody and said, oh, let's just watch, this is democracy. And look what happened. We lost it miserably, lost it big time. So we actually, our activities increased the turnout. According to the legislation, 30% was a threshold. We actually, with our activities, we increased the threshold to 32%. And then we miserably lost. 64% voted no, about lower 30 voted yes. And it took the government another year to figure out how to actually go about it. Eventually, they scrapped their legislation on referendums. They figured, well, it's too vulnerable, they could be manipulated. And then we've seen what Russians done in the Netherlands to manipulate the vote. But of course, there was also, you have to understand, I mean, a lot of Dutch feel very, there is anti-Brussels sentiment is there. There are many who believe, and a lot of them had no clue what they were voting on. A lot of them were voting, they thought it was on Ukraine's membership in the European Union, which actually was only on a trade agreement, which, by the way, was in violation of the EU law. I mean, trade agreements are never put up to a referendum, right? But that's another matter. What I want to say, Brexit happened soon after that. And how much Russia or any external powers were involved is all now a matter of, academic research and debates. But the vote, I mean, I remember I was in London the night before the vote, and I was at my alma mater at London School of Economics, and we had all these big wigs, professors talking there on stage, and I attended that debate, and everybody said, there is no way how Brexit can win in this country. No way. We have the sociological data, we have everything. And the next day they lost it, miserably lost it. And here is the pitch. I mean, okay. I mean, if they all were convinced it's not going to happen, but it did happen, right? And that's a threat. And that was 2016, right? We're now in 2025. And I think, that resilience, how do you build that resilience? How do you build that social cohesion, right? And in a way, I mean, I have to tell you that because Russians invaded 2014, we had 8 years. And it's kind of, counterintuitive observation, which again, I'm not sure if academics can prove it or not, but my hypothesis is that because of this Orange Revolution, revolution of dignity, generally Ukrainian society never really trusted Ukrainian government. And there was always skepticism about the government, and hence people had to learn how to self-organize. And that was kind of a demonstration of the Orange Revolution, then of course, a revolution of dignity, when civil society had to act. And then 8 years of war, civil society got stronger. Civil society, this is where all those volunteers who now come and support the army, they come from that one, And people kind of realized, oh, we all have to do something to help the country. And I think when war came and the political leadership, and of course Zelensky, who got out there on stage and recorded a message, said, I'm here, my team is here, and we're here to fight. That message was direct communication to the people through social media, which had a major role. And then everybody, all the society said, look, I got to do something, right? And those who volunteered joined the army, those who put in whatever, there were so many different ways to demonstrate how it all started cooperating, like cybersecurity, for instance. I mean, cybersecurity, the reason we're able to withstand the cyber attacks, which were massive, as you can imagine, our digital infrastructure. That was cooperation between government and private sector. So American companies, Googles and Amazons and others stepped in, worked with the government, supported by the local Ukrainian business. Everybody who was in cyber, they all collaborated very quickly. There was no much time left. We had to transfer our data, outside to put it in the cloud. We had to protect it. Russians were destroying it. We're talking about public data, right? Which they targeted and they wanted to destroy. Our infrastructure was initially targeted with cyber attacks. We had to protect it, right? And that was that ability of how quickly at times of crisis, your government can cooperate with your business, can cooperate with people, and make sure you have one purpose. And I don't have a solution to that. I don't know how it works, because nobody does. Because you need to have a war to understand how resilient is Australian society. You need to stress test it, right? Because how else? I mean, how do you find if your system is protected? You actually hire a company which penetrates the system and tells you, well, you see, you're vulnerable. But the problem with what we're talking here now, how do you build that resilience within the country, not to be vulnerable to disinformation, not to be vulnerable to different other things, and how do you actually keep them all together? And I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult because you see, democratic societies are very weak. I mean, there's so many weaknesses. And authoritarian leaders, authoritarian countries know how to abuse your democracy, know how to abuse your freedom of speech. I remember when 2014 happened, Russians shot down MH17. That's when most of Australians went online, where is Ukraine, right? Am I right? You had no clue where was Ukraine before 2014, right? I mean, let's be frank, you don't have to know about Ukraine because you didn't care. I mean, it's so far away. I mean, somewhere there. But once it was shot down and 38 Australians died on board of that plane, that's what got your interest, that's got your coverage. That's when everybody went to Ukraine and like, look what happened, right? But very, very quickly, Russians came up with tons of different versions of actually what happened. And then I remember like 4 or 5 weeks later, you just ask a random person, not necessarily here, but anywhere in Europe or anywhere there, so who shot down that plane? Like, oh, well, we don't know. It's actually a matter of debate, actually.
And interpretation.
And interpretation. There was that Spanish, who's that? Controller in the Spanish controller on Twitter who said that Ukrainians were targeting a plane with Putin, and they just shot down that plane. Ukrainians did it, and they just did it. Then there was like CIA organized a whole kind of story. So there were like this really absolutely ludicrous versions, but there are many of them, and they just flooded the content online. It was all over English-speaking world. It was also all over kind of in different other languages. RT, Sputnik, and all of those were just put in all those versions. And then you kind of like, even now, after the indictment by the Dutch courts, we all know who shot it down, right? But let me tell you, go to Malaysia, you ask a common Malaysian, they lost many people on board of that plane, they lost an aircraft. Who shot it down? I'm telling you, it would be like, oh, it's complicated. We don't know, actually. That would be most likely an answer, because it's like, it's confusing, right? I mean, we don't know. There's so much information about that. We're not sure. I mean, and that's a challenge.
Yeah, cutting through that noise is an enormous challenge,
Yeah.
especially if there are nefarious actors who have a vested interest in flooding the zone and creating that disquiet. You pick up on a really good point that even if you were to do the amount of fact checking, which only works 30% of the time anyway, the other 70% of the time, it's just creating distrust. Like, I can't believe this, I can't believe that. Well, I can't believe anything. And that's actually, in a way, perhaps more disempowering for people who are trying to distinguish between truth and lies. Now, I realize that we probably should be getting to Q&A now, but I've got a couple of roving mics around the floor. Does anyone have a first question to start us off for our esteemed panel? This gentleman there? Get a mic over to you.
I have two questions, really. One, with respect to Australia, you refer to the democracy.
Sorry, can you get the mic, because people are watching online, so they wouldn't hear you.
Thank you. Yes, I have 2 points to raise. One is reference to the democracies, and I do remind you that we had, and that we did have a referendum here and voted no. So in terms of your comments about democracies as an answer to disinformation, I don't agree. The second point is I'm intrigued that the development of this technology was in the West, the ownership of this technology is in the West, and yes, you're claiming that it was Russia who made far better use of that technology than the people who own it and develop it. Don't you find that to be intriguing, at least?
Yeah, sorry, maybe I was not very clear on the referendum. Referendums are probably the best way of direct vote, and some countries really know how to do it. Switzerland is probably one of the best, and it really works there. The problem with any referendum, I'm not commenting on your referendum, it's not my job to do it. I'm just saying that, any kind of vote, public vote, there is always a risk of external influence which can come in play in many different countries. And we've seen it with Brexit, we've seen it with my experience in the Netherlands, right? But then, of course, that's probably in terms of direct democracy, is still a very useful tool for democracy. So maybe I was not clear when I was explaining to that, but apparently the Dutch government or the Dutch parliament decided that that was not the case for them, and they just scrapped the legislation. Many countries have it. We have referendum legislation. So, that's just to make it clear. Any public vote could be vulnerable, in that scenario. Now, in terms of your question on technology, look, I think it's just because in Russia and China and many other authoritarian countries, changing opinion of population is a statecraft, and it's run by governments. It's run by intelligence agencies. The approach to this is really sophisticated because they invest in that. They employ actors, they employ film directors, they employ people who know how to create content, and they make it compelling, they make it engaging, they make it theatrical. This is what makes it so powerful, because you watch it, you love it. I mean, look, I sometimes watch Russian talk shows, not because I like them, but like when you kind of watch them, I mean, it's very engaging. It's like, it's very credible. And it's like, imagine watching that every night on television, like, wow. And then you start believing things you would never believe in. So, of course, I mean, we primarily talk about, American platforms, right? We talk about X, we talk about Facebook, we talk about Instagram, right? And everything. I mean, but these are just platforms, and this is user-generated content. We all create content. You create content. We create them. We all publish something. So it's all generated by users who use it. But of course, I mean, the question of regulation, I mean, there must be some sort of regulation. There were lots of debates and discussions, and probably Olga is part of those discussions here, how the government should regulate it. I mean, I don't mind it, but the thing is that, is it a solution? Will it help? The reason there is this Pravda network, which is, the reason they create these websites is actually people don't go to those websites. They only create it, as you said, for one reason, so that when you go on your tool that you use, Gemini, Grok, or, ChatGPT, it gets content out of there, right? And then, for instance, when you put it in a prompt and you're looking for something and you want to get a confirmation on certain information, does Labour government, and that was the case, in the article, I'm quoting the article from the ABC, to be correct. So there was, where they described this Pravda story, Pravda kind of operation. So there was a major kind of myth. Did Labour Prime Minister import 500,000 immigrants because that's going to generate Labour votes, right? And when you go on ChatGPT and you kind of try to verify that information, a lot of content will come from those weird websites which nobody even looks at, but it has created plenty of articles on this particular topic, where we'll say, and we'll add to that kind of feed some sort of analysis which may actually look like, legitimate corroboration of your thinking. Maybe that's true. But again, so now you can replicate. So there was a big case of copycat, another kind of special operation to undermine France. 20 different websites which look like news websites created in France. Content was created through artificial intelligence. Now you can take any article and you rewrite it with a certain angle, and you change the angle, right? Make it anti-Western, make it this, make it that, right? And then it just writes it very quickly and you publish it. So one person can produce 500 different stories, whatever, per day, 100, and you just publish it. And those websites, nobody reads those websites. But once you go on any artificial intelligence tool, because there are so many different sources confirming the same sort of information, and then you get it as a fact, right?
Olga, I think you wanted to weigh in on this one.
Yes, if I may, just because there's research coming out on the voice referendum, and it's I think it's really interesting, and I think it really illustrates the environment in which people's beliefs and behaviors could be changed. And so when the referendum was announced, surveys show that 60% of Australians were going to vote yes. And yet it ended up with a no. And there are, I think, 5 types of different approaches that were used to undermine the public vote, basically. And some of it had to do with accusations of corruption. Some of it had to do with the us versus them, the us common people versus them political elites that don't understand. Some of them had to do with deliberately inflammatory content, content that produced strong affect, fear, distrust, anger. Other approaches were, I think, now that I'm thinking, had to do with facts with absolutely unsubstantiated claims about apartheid. And so there's such a range of things that were being thrown at that referendum. And as we know, there are some, how do I say, personas of interest here in Australia that are directly affiliated with Russia. And yes, we cannot claim that Russia has intervened and it had an effect, but we know that Russia has intervened in the voice referendum. And we know that probably Russia's attempts to intervene were part of its playbook around the world. And we don't know to what extent they were able to sway the public vote, but the fact that they were involved in it and that a lot of, well, not a lot, but some certain prominent individuals were seen as participating in the public discourse around it and organizing the publics around the referendum is already concerning enough, at least to me. And I do think that we need to do better in Australia, watching some of these communities, watching some of these money flows, observing them, and not allowing them to intervene to the extent that they have.
Could I get another question, please? This lady down the front, please.
I was intrigued by your comment about humour and how that is perhaps an effective response at times. And of course, looking at the frogs and the dancing dinosaurs in Portland and things. And so I'm thinking, not to be depressing, but I'm thinking, is AI able to create humour and to create satire? In the propaganda battle.
Olga, do you want to try this one?
Yes, I've surely seen those activist communities use AI to generate content. I don't think AI itself is able to. It's using it as a tool to just make the process faster, more efficient. Yes, absolutely. But on its own, I doubt it's going to get there, even though, again, with the well-tailored prompts, we are able to achieve some remarkable results with humor and satire, and that's probably what we should be counting on to look at a more optimistic side of it, if I may.
I suppose another element of this is that AI makes these things very cheap, and you can do it at scale, right? So I can imagine a threat actor just flooding the zone with 100 different memes or jokes, and then just watching what gets the clicks, watching what gets shared, and then honing their tactics based on that. Because it costs them absolutely nothing to produce 10 news websites that look legitimate. It will cost them absolutely nothing in a few years' time to create 100 memes and then just track what is having traction with people and what they're sharing, what they're engaging with, and then using that to continue their campaigns. That would probably be my guess of how they would take that going forward. Another question, the gentleman there, sunglasses, please.
I don't have sunglasses.
You have right there.
Surprise!
Disinformation.
That's actually not disinformation. I can see that right there.
I'm going to remove them so we don't spread propaganda here. So the question more on the probably this Telegram and Twitter social medias. You said that they were moderating Twitter before like Elon Musk takeover, and about this also pro-Russian individuals that we have here in Australia that are active on Telegram, such as Aussie Cossack, I know. And so my question more is what young Australians who are very active on Telegram, and obviously government can't moderate Telegram because of the technical aspect of it, what young Australians should do to maybe spread the truth or just avoid this misinformation that comes from those Telegram channels? Thank you.
That's a great question. I'm actually quite concerned about the rates of adoption of Telegram among young Australians, and I'll explain why. I did interview some experts on Telegram that, of course, have a massive concern about Telegram's ownership and its lack of moderation. But there is an opinion out there that in Western democracy, the rates of adoption of Telegram never exceed 30%. They hover at about 20%. We see an increasing use in Malaysia, in Singapore, in South America, and of course in Ukraine and in some European countries. Somehow in the Western democracy, there seems to be a ceiling. And one of the explanations that was offered to me that I find really plausible is the fact that Telegram serves as an interface for organized crime. And so that might explain why there's a certain, it's almost like you don't have to go on the dark web because there's Telegram, and all of these activities, because of its lack of moderation, can be done on Telegram with seeming ease. So I'm actually quite concerned about young Australians being on Telegram. I don't think they should. It's not especially in the context, I know it's ridiculous because in the context of the social media ban, right, there's always, there's a very fine line between banning social media, which is a lot of human rights advocates say it's undemocratic, and they say it's, you know, it's violating our rights for free speech and everything. And Vasyl might have an opinion about, because Ukraine did practice banning some platforms that were detrimental to its national security, and with great success, I must say, even though also it was a really painful process. But I do think that some platforms do pose a national security risk, and they actually pose a domestic risk in terms of the organized crime networks that are able to use those media. So I do think that, yeah, I'm a little concerned about young people. I'm not concerned. I'm actually one of the people who speaks up against the social media ban. But in the case of Telegram, I absolutely think it should be banned. But that's just me. Maybe my colleagues have other.
I was wondering if Natalia has any.
I agree completely that it's a good example of Ukraine doing this. And I think we did it already when we experienced Russian invasion. Yes. So when we experienced the Russian invasion, so we had Contacted. There was a very popular social media platform in Ukraine, basically the main one, but that was headquartered and controlled in Moscow. And it was banned after 2014. And sometimes the authority, the government needs to take that, let's say maybe radical measures, but for the national security, it's very much needed. So again, it's really hard because very often democracies are not doing that. They're arguing if that's a freedom of speech violation or not until it's late. Well, because Ukraine had the same experience, but probably, you know, like for Australia, if we are talking right now, as I heard in the last couple of days that, well, you know, in Australia, we don't see that much of disinformation. The main idea would be just don't wait when it's too late.
Very good advice. So we might have to bundle a couple of questions together. Do we have any other questions? Okay, so what I'm going to do is take that lady up the back there, if I may. Mike's coming your way.
I just wrote down my question. So information, it's obviously always been used as a weapon of war. And I was just wondering, like, obviously social media is more decentralized than traditional mass media. And do you think that this decentralization has had an increased or decreased impact on propaganda, indoctrination, and disinformation?
Well, big one. And maybe on the other side, if I could get that gentleman up the back there. We'll try to continue to next.
Hi, thank you to the speakers. I wanted to quote a comment in relation to the voice referendum from Cabinet Minister Jason Clare, who talked about rallies organised by pro-Kremlin activist Ozzy Kozak, and said, you know, these were events that were organised inside the Russian consulate. So this is all out in public, that we do know that there was intervention in the referendum. And I wondered if perhaps the ambassador or Dr. Boichak had other examples of Russia intervening in Australian politics. What do we know about, say, the past 5 years and attempts to really operationalize community division?
Feel free to tackle either of those two. Anyone on the panel?
Sure, I will address the first question. War has become participatory. With the fragmentation and diffusion, it has enabled lots of different actors to participate in the information ecosystem in ways that were not possible before. So the ways have changed. There's lots of new emerging repertoires of the use of information in the conduct of war. There's also an increasing awareness that each of the socially mediated acts, each of our acts online do matter. And we see that with Ukrainian volunteers that really use social media to rally up the resources, to organize, to deliver the critical military humanitarian aid where it's needed, when it's needed. So in a lot of ways, it has expedited the conduct of a lot of operations, but it also puts people involved in them, it eludes the distinction between military and civilians in wars. And that is the danger of it. But Ukrainians often are asked, what are the normative implications? Should people be involved in war zones? And this is kind of like, this is a no-brainer for us. It's kind of like we just do. And this, maybe the ambassador.
I want to talk a little bit about what I've seen here, what Russians are doing, and I've identified several actors in Australia that have been promoting Russian narrative and doing it kind of systematically. One of them is Ross Cameron, and the other one is Corey Bernardi, right? Both are former politicians. I think both of them are federal politicians. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe one of them was federal, one was state. And they, for the past 3.5 years, whatever comments they provide, they are all pro-Russian, and they come just from one of those stories, Russians invaded Ukraine because they built biolabs in Ukraine, and therefore they had to invade. And those biolabs were designed to create weapons of mass destruction to hit Russia, right? Or, you just, there are 10 bullet points what Russians are saying. So there are two Australians who are on television, on radio, online, repeating those, right? Another example, to a lesser extent, which is kind of interesting, is for me, is Tom Switzer, right? Tom Switzer used to run this reputable think tank, right? Maybe he's a good economist, but every time he talks about international relations, he talks about the school of realism. Of those of you who study IR, there's John Mearsheimer, and which is, has a right for a discussion, kind of in academic environment. But he actually, the way he presents it to Australian public is pretty much the same Russian kind of Kremlin talking points. And because he's got a reputation as an economist, and I understand, I read his economic stuff, it's pretty good, I think, from what I can read. I couldn't agree with that. But every time he writes about foreign policy, that was like from the Kremlin. If somebody knows Tom Switzer, please ask him where it's coming from, okay? I'm just curious, right? But he's been on television a lot. He's done lots of public talks, including those gentlemen I met. These are just, 3 names that I'm throwing at you, right? Apart from Ozzy Kozak, of course, who's been calling me, and we had our own kind of, he disclosed my phone number to his network of anti-vaxxers, and all those radicals have been calling me, and I had fun about 3 years ago. And I've asked police, what should I do? They told me, change the phone number. I said, never. I'm not going to change the phone number. All journalists have my phone number, so I keep it. So they just stopped calling me, But it was, that's just one of the, the guy sits in the Russian consulate, and he organizes campaigns out of the Russian consulate, any kind of campaigns, right? And exactly this new media enables him to do it. Very creative guy, actually. And he's Australian, got an Australian accent. He records a message, he spreads it out. And, there are many people who just like what he's saying. And they just follow him. And he just, now call the ambassador, call him a bastard, they're all calling me, But I don't know why. That's actually interesting, because we have bipartisan support here. Liberal Party supports Ukraine as much as Labour, as much as Independents and Teals and all others, So that was quite strange, because generally, and that was an interesting experience I had. Well, probably not because it's reported, but generally, that's the whole thing. Conservatives support Ukraine. Tony Abbott is one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine. He traveled to Ukraine 6 times. Scott Morrison is a big supporter of Ukraine. So it's actually here, it's more nuanced, right? In America, it's different, right? By the way, in right and left. By the way, Natalia, how is that in America? On a kind of left and right kind of side of politics in terms of support for Ukraine. It's more nuanced, right, with Republicans.
Yes, well, see, like the Ukraine experienced bipartisan support for many, many years in the United States till the recent time. And that all kind of like, let's probably reduce the amount of military support for Ukraine was coming actually from the conservatives. And it's naturally coming because when we had before the Democratic president, and then you see like the prices are rising, and the gas is rising, and you're like, oh, like something is wrong. What is wrong? That's because we're giving money to Ukraine. You know what I mean? So you're not satisfied with your current government, and you're trying to look, how you can find that solution. And basically, conservatives been fueling fire in that topic. And here is Russia. They saw that it's a great opportunity to, erode the support of Ukraine, because like if there is no military support, there is problem on the battlefield in Ukraine. So that kind of like a naturally happening in the country, with just basically, let's say democracy is creating it,
It's been quite remarkable to see Zelensky become kind of his imaginary of the imaginary of Zelensky turned from a kind of a hero
Yes.
very quickly after that incident in the Oval Office.
Yes.
How the tables have turned on him.
It was even before because, by the way, there is very well known right now, there was NBC report that there was like disinformation operators that calls Storm 1516 that headquartered in St. Petersburg, Russia. They produced in 2023, 2024, right before elections in the US, a lot of content, video, and it's not just like one or two, it was like dozens of them because you don't know what will go viral. But they've been exactly with the aim to target the support, military support to Ukraine, saying, Zelensky and his team, they are buying yachts. And here is the proof. This is the documents of those yachts and houses that he's buying for US taxpayers' money. And when you can imagine when a person who is like from the conservative side and they're like, well, we're living really bad, the prices are high, and seeing that video, he's like, wow, that's the salute. That's exactly what happening. And Zelensky can go on media million times saying, I don't have the yachts. They would not believe him. They would believe that person because, again, Russia psychologically using our values, political views, emotions, things like that, very well.
Tapping very effectively
Yeah.
into that sort of localized, very
Exactly.
personal grievance on a
And it's going, like Ambassador said in the beginning, it's really hard to target, again, that same audience and say that's not true unless it is basically in this case, the conservatives, and somebody from conservative side would go publicly, like opinion maker, and would say that maybe then it would change somebody's opinions, but it's really not
It's
effective.
hard to prove the absence of a yacht.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
onus is
Well, you know
it's a
what?
weird onus to
NBC did the report, so they actually sent a like journalist request to that young company, and they said, well, we still have those yachts, so it's not bought yet. So, but again, NBC, right? Who, you know what I mean? Not many people from conservative side would believe
Fake
it.
news.
Yeah. Yes.
We probably have time for just one more bundle of questions. This gentleman here has been quite patient, and I might go to that lady over there.
Is this good? Good.
Great.
Shifting the focus back to the global south, including in Southeast Asia, Russia's been quite effective for a long time at pitching itself as a reliable third partner and alternative to China and the United States, even though economically and in most other sectors, Russia's got very little to offer itself. Why is Russia's narrative specifically so effective, and how do you counter it?
Look, should we take another one? Yeah.
Can we give the mic to the lady in the dress there? Thank you.
We've spoken a lot about disinformation in our society. how effective is disinformation in the Russian society?
Okay, so I'll start with the first one. So why Russia has been so effective comes back from history. And in the times of the Soviet Union, the non-alignment movement, remember 1955, Bandung Conference in Indonesia, they all convened there, South Africa, Brazil, and other countries, India as well. They said, look, we are non-aligned. I mean, there is Soviet Union, there is America. We don't want to be with any of those, right? And we're going to trade and do business with both, right? And that was part of their kind of foreign policy. The only nuance here is that the main principle of non-alignment movement is non-aggression. And Russia has committed an act of aggression. And actually, funny enough, in 2022, when Russia's invaded, all those countries, 141 countries, including most of those countries of non-alignment movement, they've actually denounced and condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine. But then kind of politics kind of changed, right? And you have to look at dependencies. Well, firstly, historic narrative of anti-Western narrative, which exists in the global South, is there. Russians can build on that. And secondly, they depend on Russia often. They depend on Russia on the supply of oil, like in case of India, or supply of food, which is the case of Indonesia. Could be also supply of weapons, which is very important. India is buying lots of weapons from Russia, the same as Indonesia is buying lots of military kit from Russia. And Russians are heavily present. Russians localize the content, as I explained previously. Their embassy is pretty big in Jakarta, right? Much smaller than us, right? Than the Ukrainian embassy. You have the largest embassy in the world, which is based in Jakarta. But do you have a special envoy on democracy? You have a special envoy on the Indian Ocean. You have a special envoy on anti-corruption. But the problem is that maybe Americans usually have their value-based foreign policy when they try to promote democracy, and it depends on where you do it. In many countries, it never worked, right? Because in different societies, maybe democracy is not what they need. But at the same time, when you kind of forget about it, and different governments, they have different priorities. And for many of those countries, the priority is their own national security. And for a country of 280 million people, your national security is cheap supply of energy and food, because your security depends on that. And in these circumstances, it's probably they have to deal with Russia. It's in their national interest. And then, of course, the influence. So this is where the influence comes from, right? So, I mean, it's more complicated, and I don't know how to counter that. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, maybe some people know how to deal with that, but, we definitely need more engaging content in explaining what Russians are doing and why Russia's invasion of Ukraine is consequential for the whole region. That's the most important war in the world right now. It's not because we are Ukrainians. It's just because we have a nuclear power, which is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which is waging the largest war in the world at the moment. 650,000 Russian troops on the ground in Ukraine. Can you imagine that? We haven't seen such a movement of troops since the Second World War. Casualties every day, 1,000 people, every day. You cannot even imagine what it is. And the way it's going to play out there has an immediate impact here in the Indo-Pacific, because it's the best deterrence that Australia can build is make sure that Russia fails in Ukraine. As simple as that. And the future of all these countries in Southeast Asia depend on that. Because if Russians can do it, other countries could get emboldened and inspired to do the same thing. Because at the end of the day, in the world of jungle, the might is right. And of course, smaller countries have no chance, just no chance whatsoever.
So I just wanted to add that I'm sure that in the nearest couple of years, we'll see more problems and challenges with Russian disinformation, especially in this region, because we've been all depending on the United States as a leader, helping at least spread a little bit of the voice, democratic voice in this region through, for example, Voice of America or those programs of US aid that Olga mentioned before, which was like for the studying, teaching some, for example, like female leaders or different communities, those things right now. we need to accept and understand that US is not gonna, they are cutting funds they cut funds for West America, for many programs in the US aid, which give us, we will be rolling back in the democracy in those regions when Russia is gonna basically monopolize the information space in those regions. So that's gonna be another problem, and we'll see the result, I'm sure, like in the nearest future.
Okay, finally, can we just have a quick comment on the second question about the effectiveness of Russian disinformation inside Russia?
Do you want to say about the Kursk?
Oh, yeah. Just one comment and one observation. Do you know what was the most successful Ukrainian information offensive? Basically, something that we've done, which really has Russian propaganda collapse. That happened last year, and that was Kursk operation. When Ukrainian troops got into Kursk and we occupied part of Russia, Russian propaganda did not know how to deal with that. I mean, we caught them by surprise. Of course, it goes in combination with military activities, and basically we invaded parts of Russia. But the fact that even Russian propaganda did not know how to explain that, because they couldn't protect their own territory, and hence, I mean, the playbook was not there. They didn't know how to explain that. They couldn't deny it because you couldn't really hide it, because in the world of social media, I mean, everybody was reporting the invasion from the Ukrainian side. And that was, you know, it's interesting. I've read, I mean, there was kind of one research. So Putin always does surveys, you know, even dictators do surveys, right? And he's polling very high. His support is very high. But once it drops below 60, he's very concerned. And that study proved that when Kursk happened, it dropped by 50%. And that was a huge blow to him, because it was like they felt helpless. But again, I mean, this is just, you know, we couldn't do it through pure information kind of say, I mean, it had to be military invasion, basically. A lot of people died. But that was pretty successful.
But other than that, Putin and the Kremlin have been very active in curtailing media freedoms in Russia for years and years now. So they are at a point where most of the platforms are splintered off from the main platform. Russians have their own TikTok. Russians are banned from using Facebook and X. They can still access them using VPNs. Russia has now launched its own version of Wikipedia. And experts say that the next step is going to be the complete banning of the use of VPNs, which essentially will completely isolate the Russian ecosystem. They will actually have achieved the digital sovereignty utopia, in a sense that the whole ecosystem will be fully isolated from external influences, except for perhaps the peer-to-peer sharing networks, which might be still there. So yeah, it's quite remarkable to see how the Russian audience has been segmented away. I'm sure they know what is happening, but it's easy to pretend like one doesn't, because it's.
And also, you know, like I just one comment. Why I didn't want to answer on that question, because we all know that Russian government created Iron Curtain basically for their society, which is like they are in a deep trouble, and I'm not sure any tools from the Western countries are gonna work there. Sorry, like this is like honestly speaking, many people actually accepting what's going on there. Many people, I can say that because I'm not a part of the government anymore. So
Look,
and yeah, and you know, like for me right now, it's more important to see what we can do so they're not spreading it to the world, first of all.
Yep. So if you are interested in the topic of propaganda, I want to advertise my friend's books. It's Peter Pomerantsev. He's written 3 books on propaganda. His last one is fascinating. He actually goes deep into the archives and researches times of Second World War and how Brits were trying to fight Nazi and actually penetrate their media space. They created this numerous radio stations, and they were basically cosplaying Germans and using lots of different entertainment, porn, and lots of like weird stuff, which they created the content on the radio, but they were trying to undermine Germans from within, actually, when they were actually saying, well, actually, you know, Hitler's not that strong. I mean, he's not cracking down, you know, enough on those countries or whatever. I mean, so basically, you know, from within, and it's an interesting case. He's also written a fascinating book, which is his first book about Russia. So Peter Pomerantsev was born in Ukraine, but he grew up in Europe and Britain, Ukrainian Jewish, and he's lived in Russia for 10 years in media business and was a media producer, right? And he's written this book in 2014 called Nothing is True, Everything is Possible, about modern day Russia. And he actually describes Russian society, and this will be very interesting for you, Natalka, to actually how it is and how new media and actually television has changed Russian society. Fascinating book, reads like almost a fiction, but it's true. And then there's also a book, This Is Not Propaganda, where he analyzes propaganda in different parts of the world. And it's quite fascinating, all the 3 books, and the way he writes, the way he explains it. It's kind of engaging. You know, I recommend going, you know, it's sold here at bookstores. You can buy it easily. Peter Pomerantsev, and any of his books is fascinating. So read him up. Yeah.
I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for this event, but thank you so very much for joining us. A couple of key takeaways from me, amongst all this little bit of gloom and doom, but these events always highlight to me how much we need to protect our information ecosystem and be constantly vigilant against that. I think some of the encroachments that we've talked about along that long arc of number of like decades now in Russia and Russian malign influence overseas, it has occurred incrementally. It has often occurred somewhat silently, or action has been taken far too soon. Well, it's sort of like a slow cancer that allows to metastasize. So I think a really big takeaway for me is how much we have to defend, how much we can't take for granted, and how much we need to be vigilant against these kind of things affecting our society and our social cohesion. So on that, could you please join me in thanking our panel of